The bailiff arrived at dawn, and the whole village knew what that meant before he'd even dismounted. A man on a horse at that hour could only be bringing one of three things: a new tax, an old debt recalled, or a summons to the Lord's court. The fact that he brought two men-at-arms with him narrowed it down considerably. I want to talk about what it meant to be a peasant in medieval France, not the romantic version with maypoles and jaunty songs, but the actual machinery of it, the day-to-day reality of being born into a category of person that was, in almost every legal and practical sense, owned. Not owned in the way a chair is owned, or even in the way a slave is owned. Owned in a more insidious fashion, owned through the land itself, through the fact that you were attached to a plot of soil so completely that you could not leave it, and it could not leave you. The Latin word was servus, and from it we get serf, but the translation is misleading. A serf was not a slave, and that distinction, narrow, legalistic, and cold comfort to the people who lived within it, is where the whole story begins. Let me stay with the bailiff for a moment, because his visit captures something essential about how the system worked. He would have been a literate man, probably minor nobility or a trained clerk, carrying a roll of parchment that listed every household in the village, every strip of land, every obligation owed to the Lord. His arrival meant that something on that roll had come due. Perhaps it was the cens, the annual rent that every tenant paid for the right to work their strip of land, a few sous, a chicken, a measure of grain, sometimes all three. Perhaps it was the banalité, the fee for using the Lord's mill or his oven, because in many parts of France you were not permitted to grind your own grain or bake your own bread. You had to use his facilities, and you had to pay for the privilege. The Lord's oven was not a convenience offered to his tenants. It was a right he possessed, a monopoly enforced by law, and that right was worth money, his money, extracted from your labor. The bailiff's parchment roll was, in its own way, as powerful a weapon as anything in the men-at-arms belts. It was the physical manifestation of a system that had been growing since the Roman Empire collapsed, a system in which every inch of soil, every tree, every stream, and every person on the land had a designated place and a designated cost. A document known as the Polyptych of Erminin, compiled around the year 823 at the monastery of Saint-Germain-des-Prés just outside Paris, lists the holdings of that single abbey with a precision that is almost chilling. Each entry names the tenant, the size of his plot, what he owes in grain, in livestock, in coin, and in days of labor. The document runs to thousands of entries across 24 estates. And what strikes me, when I read through the surviving fragments, what genuinely stops me cold, is how many different kinds of obligation are enumerated. It is not just rent. It is plowing the Lord's fields, carrying his wine to market, repairing his fences, feeding his hounds, providing a horse when he travels, collecting firewood for his hearth. The peasant's life, on paper, was a cascade of debts that never fully cleared. What made this system so durable was that it was not arbitrary. That is a hard thing to sit with, because arbitrary cruelty is easier to condemn and easier to dismantle. But the feudal economy of medieval France ran on custom, and custom meant that obligations were inherited, codified, and mutually reinforced across generations. The bailiff did not invent the debt he came to collect. He found it recorded in a document that had been updated by his predecessor, who had copied it from an older document, which itself had been drawn up decades earlier based on the verbal testimony of village elders. The chain of authority was unbroken, and it gave the system a legitimacy that pure force could never have achieved. When the peasant paid the cens, he was not submitting to extortion. He was fulfilling an obligation that his grandfather had fulfilled, that his father had fulfilled, that his son would fulfill after him. The weight of tradition was, in this case, quite literally a weight. Mud, that is the image I keep returning to. The fields of northern France in the 12th century were not the tidy checkerboards of modern agriculture. They were open strips, narrow and long, shared among families who had worked them for generations. and they were, for most of the year, mud. Not the clean, brown mud of a garden. A thick, clinging, gray-brown mud that sucked at wooden shoes and made every trip to the well or the pasture a small physical ordeal. The peasant's world was built on mud, walked through in mud, measured by mud. When the bailiff came to inspect the fields, he came on horseback and stayed on the roads. The peasant met him on foot in the mud, looking up. Here is where I have to be careful, because the temptation is to paint every peasant as equally miserable, and that simply was not the case. The category we lumped together as peasants actually contained a spectrum of legal and economic statuses so wide that a person at one end would barely recognize the life of a person at the other. At the top of this spectrum was the frank tenancier, the free tenant, who held land by a fixed rent and could, in theory, leave whenever he chose. He answered to the lord for his rent and his share of the harvest, but his person was not bound. He could marry without permission, travel to a market town, even lease additional land if he had the means. Below him was the serf de cour, the serf in the fullest sense, bound to the land, required to pay the mainmort, a death tax that allowed the lord to claim the best animal from the serf's possessions when he died, and subject to the formerage, a fine paid if a serf married someone from outside the lord's domain. Below even that, there were serfs whose obligations were so complete that they needed the lord's permission to marry at all, and whose children automatically inherited their status with no avenue for escape. I want to pause on the mainmort, because it is one of those institutions that reveals the true logic of the system in a way that no generalization can. When a serf died, the lord had the right to take the best beast from his herd, or if he had no beasts, his best piece of furniture, his best tool, or in some cases a portion of his stored grain. The justification was straightforward. The serf did not truly own his property. He held it from the lord as a tenant, and the lord could reclaim a share upon his death. In practice, this meant that a family could work a plot of land for 3 generations, build up a small herd of sheep, accumulate a few modest possessions, a brass pot, a good woolen cloak, an iron-headed plow, and then watch a meaningful portion of that wealth walk away to the lord's barn every time the patriarch died. The mainmort was not theft in the medieval legal mind. It was a contractual right. The lord owned the land. The serf was part of the land. Therefore, the serf's surplus belonged, at least in part, to the lord. The logic was impeccable and cruel, which is a combination that turns up with disturbing frequency in medieval legal documents. To me, the most unsettling part of the mainmort is not the tax itself, but the psychological architecture it implies. If you know that a portion of everything you build will be taken when you die, you learn to think differently about accumulation. You learn to hide things, to undervalue your own possessions when the bailiff comes to assess them, to pass wealth through channels that don't appear on any written roll. You become, out of necessity, a person who lives partly outside the written record. And this is one of the great ironies of peasant life. The people who generated the material wealth of medieval France are also the people about whom we know the least, because they had every reason to keep their lives and their possessions invisible. And if you're reading this in a quiet room, maybe late at night, try to picture that particular kind of silence, the silence of a household after the bailiff has left, when the father is sitting by the fire calculating what remains, what can be hidden, what must be surrendered. The mother is mending a garment by the last of the daylight coming through the unglazed window. A child is asleep on a pile of straw in the corner. That silence is not peace, it is strategy. It is the sound of a man deciding how to survive the next year without losing the ground he has gained over the last 10. Let me talk about the land itself, because the land was not just the source of the peasant's misery, it was also the only thing standing between him and starvation. A typical peasant family in 12th century northern France worked a strip or 2 of arable land, perhaps enough to feed 4 or 5 people in a good year. A good year. In a bad year, a wet spring that rotted the seed, a summer hailstorm that flattened the stalks, an early frost that turned the grain to paper. The margin between survival and disaster was thin enough to see through. Famine was not a dramatic event that arrived and departed. It was a constant pressure, a low-grade fever that broke into a full crisis every 8 or 10 years when the harvest failed across a wide enough area. The years 1124 and 1125 brought famine to much of northern France. The years 1195 through 1197 were worse. In some regions, people ate. The seed grain meant for spring planting, which guaranteed that the following year would also fail, which guaranteed that the year after that would be worse still. A cascade of deprivation that fed on itself with mechanical precision. What did hunger actually look like in a medieval village? Not the cinematic kind, with gaunt figures stumbling through empty fields while a mournful cello plays. It looked like substitution. When the wheat ran out, you ground barley, which was normally reserved for livestock, and which made a bread so dense it was said to sit in the stomach like a stone. When the barley ran out, you ground oats, which were meant for horses. When the oats ran out, you gathered acorns, beech mast, the roots of wild plants, anything organic that could be pounded into a rough flour and baked into something that would fill a stomach without providing much nutrition. The bread that came out of these substitutions was dark, dense, bitter, and sometimes barely edible. It was not food in any meaningful sense. It was a way of postponing the moment when there was nothing left to eat at all. I want to acknowledge something here that complicates the picture and that I think is important to be honest about. Not every peasant was starving, and not every lord was a parasite. The economic relationship between lord and peasant was, at its core, a bargain. The peasant provided labor and produce, and the lord provided protection from bandits, from rival lords, from the general chaos that had followed the collapse of Carolingian authority in the 9th and 10th centuries. In periods when that protection was real and meaningful, the system could function with a degree of mutual, if profoundly unequal, benefit. There were lords who reduced rents during famine years, who maintained granaries that kept their tenants alive through the worst months, who arbitrated disputes with something approaching fairness. The Chronicle of the Monastery of Saint Pierre-le-Vif in Sens records him. Abbot who opened his grain stores to the surrounding villages during the famine of 1125 and refused to collect rents until the harvest returned to normal. Such men existed, but the problem is that these lords were exceptional enough to be remarked upon in the Chronicles, which tells you something about the baseline expectation. When generosity is newsworthy, generosity is not the norm. And here is a contradiction that I keep circling back to, one that I cannot fully resolve. The same system that bound the peasant to the land also gave him a kind of security that wage laborers in the growing towns did not have. A serf could not be evicted because he was part of the land. He could not be fired. His children would inherit his plot because the land needed hands to work it, and the lord needed the produce those hands could generate. In a world without social safety nets, without insurance, without any institution that would catch you if you fell, this attachment to the soil was a form of grotesque, degrading security. I honestly cannot decide if this makes the system better or worse. It is one thing to be exploited. It is another to be exploited in a way that you cannot leave because leaving means death, and to have that impossibility of leaving described by the people, who benefit from your stay as a kindness. The church added its own layer of extraction, and it did so with a sophistication that the secular lords could only envy. The tithe, a tenth of everything the peasant produced, measured in grain, livestock, eggs, wool, and sometimes labor, went to the local parish, and it was not optional. It was a moral obligation enforced by the threat of spiritual punishment, which in a society that genuinely believed in the reality of hell and purgatory was not an abstract threat. The parish priest was often as poor as his flock, living in a damp stone house next to the church, eating the same dark bread, wearing the same rough wool. But the priest answered to a bishop, and the bishop answered to an archbishop, and at the top of that chain sat an
你把那
institution that
些
accumulated
有报
land,
过的留
wealth,
着，
and political power on a scale that
其实留不
rivaled
留我
any
无所谓
secular
了。我操，
lord.
你报过
The
了已经
peasant who
很长
paid
时
his
间了，
tithe was
你
funding
现在
me.
再去整，那肯定也是什么
Hierarchy
呀？
that he would never
对，
benefit
都让人
from,
家
and that, in
整
many
废了。
cases, did not consider him fully capable of the spiritual refinement that the educated clergy enjoyed. Theologians debated whether the rustic soul was capable of the same depth of religious experience as the noble soul, and while the official doctrinal answer was always yes, God shows no partiality, and all souls are equal before him, the practical answer, visible in every tithe barn and every ecclesiastical court, was something closer to maybe, with a shrug. Picture the village now. It is early spring, and the fields have just been plowed for the first time. The mud is at its worst half frozen in the morning, a gray soup by midday when the weak sun reaches it, frozen again by evening. Smoke rises from the wattle and daub houses, low structures with thatched roofs and earthen floors, often shared with livestock in the colder months because an animal's body heat was too valuable to waste. The smell is of wood smoke, dung, and the sour tang of last year's grain stored in a pit beneath the floorboards. A rooster calls from somewhere behind the church, and the sound carries across the empty fields with a clarity that the modern world has almost forgotten. The Lord's oven, a stone structure larger than any house in the village, stands at the edge of the common, its chimney cold until the baker arrives to heat it for the day's baking. Every woman in the village will carry her dough there, pay her fee in coin or in a portion of the flour itself, and take her bread home. There is no alternative. The oven is the Lord's, and so is the grain, and so, in a sense that goes deeper than law, is the bread. I said earlier that the serf was not a slave, and I want to come back to that distinction because it mattered enormously to the people who lived within it. A slave could be sold as an individual. A serf could not be sold, at least not in theory, though the sale of land with its attached peasants happened regularly enough, which meant that serfs did change hands, just not as separate commodities. A slave had no legal personality at all. A serf could appear in court, could bring certain kinds of suits against his lord, could own property within defined limits. A slave's children belonged to the master absolutely. A serf's children inherited his status and his land, which meant they inherited his obligations, but also his plot, his tools, his place in the village community. These differences were real, and the peasants who fought to maintain them, who sued in ecclesiastical courts. Lord overstepped custom, who negotiated charters that spelled out their rights in unprecedented and sometimes surprising detail, were not deluded. They were defending the narrow space between serfdom and slavery, because that space, however cramped, was where their lives were actually lived. But there is a cost to defending a cage, even one with a few amenities, and the cost was that the cage became normal. The peasant did not dream of freedom in the way we might expect, because freedom, the ability to leave, to own fully, to choose one's livelihood, was an abstraction that had almost no practical meaning in his world. What he dreamed of was a better harvest, a lighter hand from the bailiff, a son strong enough to plow the heavy northern clay, a daughter who could marry into a family with an extra strip of land and a slightly larger herd. The horizon of expectation was not set by philosophy or by political theory,
我是
but by
把
the
那个，因为
seasons,
怕
and
这
the
个 AI 重
seasons were
复成本
pitiless
高嘛，
teachers. You learned what was possible by watching the sky, by feeling the
他能
soil,
看
by
只
counting
能
the
看懂大
sacks
概
of
意思，
grain
能
in the
看懂大概意思
storeroom,
的呢。
and you adjusted your hopes accordingly. The motif, if there is one that runs through this whole story, is mud. The mud that froze and cracked in winter, leaving deep ruts in the road that would become small rivers when the thaw came. The mud that softened and swallowed in spring, turning the lower fields into bogs that could swallow a cart up to its axle. The mud that caked on the plowshare and had to be scraped off with a wooden tool before the next furrow could be cut, a task repeated hundreds of times in a single day of plowing. The mud on the bailiff's boots when he dismounted in the village square, the mud on the peasant's hands when he knelt to check whether the seed had germinated, the mud that was both the substance of his livelihood and the visible mark of his condition. Mud did not care about legal status. It clung to free tenant and serf alike, and in the fields at dawn, with the frost still white on the hire.
这个我觉得现
Ground,
在
the
在我们
distinction
做应该一
between
点
them
问题
was
没有。
invisible.
他
The
们能做，
distinction
我们为什
only
么不？
mattered when the bailiff
而
opened
且
his
它这个
roll.
一个
What I
很
find
简单的
most
一篇文
difficult
章。
to convey, across this distance of 800 years, is the totality of it. Being a peasant was not a job you did between certain hours and then set aside. It was not even a class you belonged to, in the modern sense of class as an economic category that can be changed through effort or luck. It was a condition, legal, social, spiritual, physical, that pervaded every moment of your existence. You woke in a house built on the Lord's land. You ate bread baked in the Lord's oven from grain ground in the Lord's mill. You worked fields that belonged to the Lord, paid rent to the Lord, paid tithes to the church that legitimized the Lord's rule, and when you died, the Lord took his share of what remained through the mainmort. There was no outside to this. No weekend, no vacation, no retirement, no career change. The only escape for those who could reach it was the town, and the town was guarded by walls and by a different set of rules entirely. One rule in particular mattered more than any sermon. A serf who lived in a chartered town for 1 year and one day without being reclaimed by his lord became free. That rule, a single sentence in a legal code, was for some people worth more than every mass ever celebrated, every prayer ever whispered, every promise of a better life in the world to come. And so, as the bailiff mounted his horse and rode away down the road that led back to the Lord's manor, his parchment roll tucked safely in his saddlebag with its debts freshly recorded, the village returned to its work. But something had shifted, as it always shifted when the written word met the unwritten life of the fields. A payment had been promised, a date had been set. And somewhere in a house with an earthen floor and a fire that was already burning low in the late afternoon, a man was looking at his grain store and counting the days until harvest, counting the mouths he had to feed, and counting, always counting, the cost of being attached to a piece of earth that he could not leave and that could not, in the end, leave him. The mud was already drying on the hoofprints left in the road, but the mark the bailiff had made was not in the mud. It was on paper, and paper lasted. Longer than any season, longer sometimes than the people whose lives it recorded. And what that paper demanded, season after season, was not just grain or coin, but the one thing the peasant had no surplus of: his body, bent over the plow, pushing through the same mud his father had pushed through, and his father's father before him, a chain of labor that stretched back so far that no one in the village could remember when it began. But someone somewhere would remember when it ended, or rather, they would remember the morning when a different kind of mud appeared on the roads, mud churned up not by the bailiff's horse, but by something heavier, something that had not been seen in these parts for a very long time. The mud that appeared on the roads that morning was not the gray mud of spring or the iron-hard mud of winter. It was a black mud, churned by hundreds of hooves, and it smelled of horse sweat and something else that the villagers learned to recognize before they saw the men who had made it. The something else was steel, the particular smell of iron rubbed with oil, of leather straps wet with rain, of men who had been riding for days and who had not come to trade. The army passed within a quarter-mile of the village, and the entire population stood in the fields and watched. There was no point in running. If the army wanted to stop, it would stop. If it wanted to take grain, it would take grain. If it wanted to burn the houses would burn. The only question was whether the lord of this army was the same lord to whom the village owed its rents and its labor, or whether he was a different lord, because in medieval France, the difference between protection and destruction was often just a matter of whose banner flew over the column. This is the part of peasant life that the chronicles barely mention, because the chronicles were written by the men who led the armies, not by the men who hid in the ditches. When the chronicler Jean Froissart, writing in the late 14th century, describes the passage of English troops through the French countryside during the 100 Years' War, he notes the smoke rising from burning villages, the herds of cattle driven away, the granaries emptied. But he notes these things as a kind of weather, a background condition of war, not as a human catastrophe unfolding in real time. The peasant who watched his stored grain disappear into an English supply train was not a person in Froissart's telling. He was a cost of doing business, a line item in the logistics of a campaign, the same way a burned barn is not a tragedy in a modern news report. It is an incident, a number, a thing that happened somewhere to someone. I want to stay with that moment of watching because it captures something about power that the economic system alone cannot convey. The bailiff was a burden. The tithe was a burden. The mainmort was a burden. But an army on the move was something else entirely. It was the unmasking of the entire feudal bargain, the revelation that the protection the Lord supposedly provided was never guaranteed, and that when the protection failed, the peasant was not a subject to be defended, but an asset to be consumed. The Lord's army and the enemy's army looked very similar to a man standing in a field, watching his winter store vanish into a column of men he had never seen before and would never see again. Now here is the cruel irony, and it is one that the system itself could never resolve. The army that burned the fields was often the same army that was supposed to protect them. When the King of France went to war against the English, against the Burgundians, against the Empire, he raised his army by summoning his great lords, who summoned their lesser lords, who summoned their knights, who brought their men-at-arms, and those men-at-arms lived off the land as they marched. The land they lived off was French land. The peasants who fed them were French peasants, and the lord who commanded them was, in theory, the same lord to whom those peasants owed their obedience and their rents. The theory did not help when the men-at-arms took the last chicken and the last sack of oats and left the family with nothing to plant in the spring. Let me give you a specific date, because specificity makes this real in a way that generalization cannot. In August 1346, the army of Edward III of England marched through the region of Normandy, burning and looting as it advanced toward the Battle of Crécy. The English troops were not paid in coin. They were paid in what they could take, and they took everything. A French chronicle from the city of Rouen, written shortly after the event, describes the road from Cherbourg to Paris as a corridor of ash. Villages that had stood for 300 years vanished in a single afternoon. The inhabitants who survived fled into the forests, and many of them never returned, because their land had been stripped so thoroughly that there was nothing left to plant and no seed grain to plant it with. The peasant who fled his holding in 1346 and made it to a walled town might have counted himself lucky. But the town, too, had its own parasites, and a desperate peasant was rarely welcomed with open arms. What do you do as a peasant when the army comes? There were 3 responses, and each carried its own cost. The first was to flee, to take what you could carry, drive your livestock into the woods, and pray that the army moved on before you starved in hiding. This meant abandoning your home and your stored grain, which meant that even if the army did not burn your house, you might return to find it looted by other refugees, your tools stolen, your animals scattered or dead. The second was to stay and offer payment, a bribe in grain, in coin, in livestock, in whatever the army would accept, in the hope that the soldiers would take the bribe and move on without burning everything. This sometimes worked, but it required having enough to offer, and it required the soldiers to be disciplined enough to accept the bribe, which many were not. The third response was to stay and fight, and this was almost always a death sentence. A few men with scythes and pitchforks against armored men-at-arms was not a fight. It was a slaughter, and the survivors of that slaughter were usually hanged from the nearest tree as an example to the next village that might consider resistance. I have no definitive answer for why the system tolerated this contradiction, why a lord who depended on his peasants for his income would allow armies to destroy the source of that income. The best I can offer is that the logic of war and the logic of agriculture operated on different timescales, and the timescale of war was always shorter. A lord who refused to quarter an army might face the army's wrath himself. A lord who let another lord's army pass through his lands might earn a debt that could be called in later. and in the chaos of a campaign, the distinction between friend and enemy blurred so quickly that a prudent lord simply assumed that his own peasants would be plundered and planned accordingly. Which is to say, he planned to take what he could from them before someone else did. When I first read the account of the English chevauchée through Normandy in 1346, I was struck by the casualness of the destruction. The chronicler does not pause to mourn. He lists the villages burned, the castles taken, the prisoners ransomed, and moves on. Reading between the lines, you can glimpse what the chronicler does not say: the families who had nowhere to go, the fields that would go unplanted for years, the children who would not survive the winter. But the chronicler was writing for a courtly audience, and a courtly audience wanted to hear about the capture of a nobleman, not the death of a farmer's daughter. The peasant is simply not a character in the story that medieval chroniclers thought they were telling. And yet the peasant was the one who paid for the war in every sense that matters. The taxes that funded the war came from his labor. The food that fed the army came from his fields. The carts that carried the supplies came from his stable. And when the war ended, if it ended, he was the one who rebuilt, because the land could not heal itself, and the Lord would not do the work himself. Let me offer a sensory break here, because the weight of these abstractions can become numbing. Imagine the road after the army has passed. It is wider now because the verges have been trampled flat. The grass is beaten into the mud, and the mud itself is churned into a dark paste that clings to everything. A broken cart lies on its side in the ditch, its wheels snapped, its load of hay scattered and soiled. The smell is of wet horsehair, of urine, of the smoke from a dozen small fires that the soldiers lit to cook the chickens they had taken from the coops. Silence has returned, but it is not the silence of the morning before the army came. It is a different kind of silence, emptier, denser, the silence of a place that has been evacuated of everything that was alive and moving in it. The birds are gone, the dogs are gone, even the flies have not yet returned to the carcass of the sheep. That lies by the side of the road, its throat cut, its legs stiffening in the afternoon air. And if you are listening to this in the dark, with your eyes closed, imagine that particular silence, not the peace of an empty landscape, but the silence of a landscape that has been cleaned out like a room emptied of its furniture, leaving only the dust and the marks on the floor where the furniture used to stand. Now the peasant's second burden, which was related to the first, the obligation to repair the damage that the army had done, even when the army belonged to his own lord. Feudal law required tenants to maintain the roads, bridges, and fortifications on the lord's estate. This was called the corvée, a set number of days per year that the peasant had to work for free on the lord's projects. In theory, the corvée was limited to a few weeks per year. In practice, during wartime, the demand for labor expanded without limit. The lord needed his castle walls repaired after a siege. He needed the moat cleared. He needed the roads passable for his own troops. And the men who did this work were the same men whose fields had been burned and whose seed grain had been taken. The corvée did not stop because the harvest had failed. It stopped when the Lord said it stopped, and the Lord did not always. Look at the state of his tenants' fields before he made his demands. Here is a document that makes this concrete. A 1275 English estate account. I am stepping across the channel for a moment, but the practice was identical in France. Records that the tenants of a certain manor were required to provide 2 men for 3 days each week during the harvest season, not to harvest their own grain, but to harvest the Lord's grain in his domain fields. If they failed to appear, they paid a fine. If they sent a weak man or a boy, they paid a fine. And if they were ill, they paid a fine. The account is written in a neat clerical hand, and the fines are recorded in the margin with the same precision as the rents. The human cost, the family whose own grain rotted in the field because the father was working the Lord's fields, is not recorded. It is not a category that the account recognizes as relevant. I keep circling back to this same phenomenon. The written record is meticulous about obligations and nearly silent about the human beings who fulfilled them. And I think this is not an accident. The system worked best when the peasant was a number on a roll, an entry in a ledger, a name that appeared once a year and then disappeared back into the mud. Visibility was dangerous. A peasant whose life was fully recorded was a peasant who could be taxed, fined, drafted, and tracked across every transaction he made. The partial invisibility of the peasant, the fact that the chronicles mention him only when he fails to pay, when he rebels, when he dies, was not a failure of the system. It was the system functioning exactly as intended. The peasant was a resource, and resources are not characters in a story. They are the background conditions that make a story possible. And this is where I need to complicate my own argument, because it would be easy to present the medieval peasant as a pure victim, and that is not the whole truth. Peasants had agency. They staged tax revolts that could terrify the nobility, the French peasant uprising of 1358, the Jacquerie saw bands of rural laborers burning castles and killing nobles with a ferocity that shocked the continent and was answered with an even more ferocious repression. They petitioned their lords for reductions in rent, and sometimes they got them. They took their disputes to ecclesiastical courts, which sometimes ruled against secular lords on the grounds that a serf's property rights were protected by canon law. They hid grain, undervalued their livestock, married outside the domain without permission when they thought they could get away with it, and lied to the bailiff with a consistency that amounted to a second profession. A good peasant was not a compliant peasant. A good peasant was a peasant who paid just enough to avoid punishment and hid just enough to survive a bad year, and the line between those two things was the line on which survival depended. The Jacquerie of 1358 is worth pausing on because it reveals something about the peasant's life that the daily grind of labor obscures, the rage that accumulated beneath the surface. The uprising began in the region of Beauvais, north of Paris, in the summer of 1358, when a group of peasants attacked a noble castle and killed several knights. The rebellion spread with terrifying speed, and within weeks thousands of peasants were moving across the countryside, burning manor houses, destroying tax records, and killing anyone associated with the nobility. The violence was not random. It targeted the physical symbols of the system, the rolls of parchment that recorded the debts, the mills and ovens that extracted the fees, the manor houses that housed the lords and bailiffs who enforced the obligations. The peasants knew exactly what they were doing. They were not looting for profit. They were destroying the records of their own oppression. I honestly cannot decide if this uprising was brave or foolish. The bravery is obvious. To take up arms against men who had trained for war from childhood, who wore armor, who had horses, who were supported by a military system that could call on the entire chivalric class to suppress a peasant revolt, that took a kind of collective courage that is hard to imagine. The nobility responded with a ferocity that was calculated to terrify. They hunted the rebels like animals. The Chronicle of Jean Lebel describes knights riding down fleeing peasants and killing them in the fields, hanging them from trees, decapitating them, and leaving their heads on pikes at crossroads. The reprisals were not just punishment. They were a demonstration, a message written in blood that the peasant would remember as surely as the trees would remember the snow. And the message was this: the system can tolerate a certain amount of grumbling, a certain amount of petty theft, a certain amount of passive resistance. But when the system is threatened directly, the system will kill you. The Jacquerie was crushed within months, and its aftermath was brutal, but it was not forgotten. The fear of another peasant uprising haunted the French nobility for generations, and that fear sometimes translated into better treatment. In the 15th century, after the turmoil of the Hundred Years' War, many French lords granted their peasants written charters that fixed rents and reduced obligations, not out of kindness, but out of a calculation that a contented peasant was less likely to revolt, and a dead peasant paid no rent at all. The system bent under pressure, and the pressure came from below. And if you are a peasant in the early 15th century, living in a village that has been burned twice and rebuilt once, you know that the system bends, but you also know that it does not break. It bends and then it straightens, and then it bends again, and through the whole process you continue to bend with it. Your life is not a story of resistance or submission. It is a story of negotiation conducted from a position of permanent weakness, a negotiation in which the best outcome is not freedom or prosperity, but simply the continuation of a life that is hard enough to kill most of your children before they reach the age of 10. Let me speak directly to you now, because there is something about the peasant's relationship to violence that I find almost impossible to convey without turning it into abstraction. You live in a village. There are about 150 people in it, including children. You know every one of them by name. You have watched them be born, watched them grow, watched them marry, watched them die. The man who lives 2 houses down is your cousin. The woman who tends the geese on the common is your aunt. The priest is a drunk, but he knows your confession and he buries your dead. The bailiff is a stranger who comes once a month, but the Lord, you have seen the Lord perhaps 3 times in your entire life, and each time he was on horseback, surrounded by men, looking at you the same way a farmer looks at a field he is calculating the yield of. And then the army comes, and the lords. Castle survives and the manor is rebuilt, and the tithe barn is filled, but the village is a question mark. You do not know when you run into the woods with your children and the one goat you managed to save, whether you will have a village to return to. You do not know whether the house you built with your own hands will be standing. You do not know whether your cousin is alive or dead. The uncertainty is not a temporary condition. It is the permanent state of your life, as constant as the mud. When the army passed and the village was still standing, and the worst damage was the loss of the grain and 2 sheep, and the cart that had belonged to the man who died last winter, when that was the outcome, you called it a good day. You called it a good day because no one had died, because the church had not been burned, because the army had moved on and had not left a garrison. You called it a good day because the standard for a good day was so low that a miracle was simply the absence of catastrophe. Now we come to the motif that binds this chapter to the last, because the motif is not the army or the violence or the fear, it is the mud. The army churned it, the rain softened it, and the peasant continued to live in it, walk through it, work in it. The mud after the army passed was different from the mud before. It was deeper, darker, mixed with the ash of burned timbers and the straw that had been scattered from the carts, but it was still mud. And the peasant still had to plow through it, still had to plant into it, still had to harvest from it. The land did not care about the war. The land did not care about the Lord or the king or the English or the French. The land cared about the seed and the rain and the sun, and if the peasant did not put the seed into the mud, the land produced nothing. And so he put the seed into the mud, day after day, year after year, war after war. Because the alternative was not freedom, and the alternative was not a better life somewhere else. The alternative was simply a longer silence, a deeper mud, a road that led to a village that was no longer there, and then the road itself ending in a field that would never be planted again. The sun set on the day the army passed, and in the village the women lit the fires and cooked what little remained, and the men stood outside in the cooling air and looked at the sky and tried to calculate, from the angle of the light and the color of the clouds, whether the next day would bring rain or dryness, because rain would turn the churned fields into a swamp and delay the plowing, and dryness would harden the mud into a crust that the plow could not penetrate. A child was crying in one of the houses. A dog barked at the sound of a horse that turned out to be a cow. The fields stretched away into the gathering dark, and the mud lay across them like a blanket that had been thrown down after a fight, and somewhere beyond the fields, beyond the forest that marked the boundary of the Lord's domain, a different mud was being churned by a different army, moving toward a different village, carrying the same hunger and the same indifference and the same iron smell of steel and wet leather, and the same uncertainty that would reach another family standing in another field, watching the road and waiting to see what the morning would bring. The morning brought rain, as it often did in that season, and the family that had stood watching the road returned to the fields with the rain on their faces and the mud rising over their wooden shoes. The father walked ahead, carrying the plowshare on his shoulder because the cart was gone, and there was no other way to transport it. The mother carried the seed in a sack slung across her back, and the weight of it pressed against her spine with every step, a pressure she had learned to ignore the way one ignores the sound of birds at dawn, not because it is pleasant, but because it is constant, and constancy becomes silence. The children followed behind, barefoot now because their shoes had been taken by the soldiers, and their feet left small prints in the mud that filled with water almost as soon as they were made, as though the earth were erasing them as they walked. The body of the peasant was the instrument through which the entire system operated, and it is the thing that the documents describe least. A roll of parchment can record how many days of labor a man owes, how much grain he must deliver, how many chickens he must render to the Lord's kitchen. It cannot record what those days of labor felt like inside a human body, what the grain weighed when it was carried on a back bent double under a sack, what the cold did to hands that had been plunged into frozen soil to pull turnips in January. The body is absent from the record because the body was assumed. It was the given, the unspoken precondition of every entry in every ledger. The Lord did not need to be told that his tenant had a body. He needed to be told how many days that body could work, how much that body could carry, how many offspring that body could produce to ensure that the next generation would be available to work the same land under the same obligations. The peasant's body was a machine, and like all machines, it was valued for its output, maintained only to the degree that maintenance preserved output, and replaced through reproduction when it wore out. I want to talk about what that machine was asked to do, because the sheer physical demands of medieval agriculture are almost impossible to convey to a modern body that has never plowed a field by hand. The plow itself was a heavy wooden implement tipped with an iron share, and in the heavy clay soils of northern France, it required not one man but a team, usually 2 oxen and 2 men, one to drive the animals and one to press the share down into the earth and guide it along the furrow. The man who guided the share did so with his hands on the wooden handles, his weight pushing downward and forward, his feet braced against the mud that the plow was cutting through. Every stone the share struck sent a jolt up through his arms and into his shoulders. Every root that caught the blade required him to stop, kneel, and dig the obstruction free with his fingers, while the oxen stood steaming. The cold air, a good day of plowing covered perhaps half an acre. A bad day covered less, and a bad day was any day when the rain came hard enough to turn the furrows into channels of standing water, or when the wind was so cold that the oxen's breath hung in clouds, and the man's hands lost feeling in the first hour and did not regain it until the fire was lit at noon. To me, the most revealing detail about the physical life of the medieval peasant is not the labor itself, but the caloric arithmetic that underpinned it. An adult man performing heavy agricultural labor needs approximately 3,000 calories per day to maintain his body weight and function. A peasant in 12th century France, eating a diet composed primarily of dark bread made from mixed grains, supplemented by whatever vegetables he could grow in his garden plot and whatever eggs or dairy his animals produced, consumed somewhere between 1,700 and 2,200 calories on an average day. The deficit was made up by the body itself, which consumed its own fat and muscle during periods of heavy labor and rebuilt them during periods of relative rest, a cycle of depletion and partial recovery that left the body in a permanent state of deficit. The peasant was, in a literal physiological sense, always hungry, not starving, not in the dramatic sense of famine, but hungry in the way that a machine running on insufficient fuel is hungry, functional, but only just and only for so long. Here is where I need to pause and admit something that complicates the picture I have been building. The peasant's diet, while monotonous and calorically marginal, was not uniformly terrible. Recent work on medieval nutrition, particularly studies that analyze skeletal remains from rural cemeteries in northern France, suggests that the average peasant was not severely malnourished in the way that, say a 19th century industrial worker might have been. The bread was coarse but nutritious. The garden plot, if well tended, could provide a surprising variety of vegetables: cabbage, beans, peas, onions, leeks, turnips. Dairy products, when available, added protein and fat, and the forest, where the peasant had access to it, supplemented the diet with wild greens, mushrooms, berries, and occasionally small game, though the latter was technically poaching and could result in severe punishment. The picture is not one of constant starvation, but of chronic marginality, a life lived on the edge of enough, where one bad harvest or one additional mouth to feed could tip the balance from adequacy to deficiency within a single season. But the body kept a record of that marginality, even when the documents did not. Skeletal remains from medieval rural cemeteries show high rates of dental caries from the grit in stone-ground flour, signs of osteoarthritis in the spines and joints of men and women who died in their 30s and 40s, evidence of childhood anemia in the porous bone tissue of individuals who had survived early malnutrition but carried its marks for the rest of their shortened lives. The average adult height, reconstructed from long bone measurements, was significantly lower than in earlier Roman populations or later modern ones, a direct indicator of chronic nutritional stress during childhood and adolescence. The body of the peasant was shorter, more worn, and more fragile than the body of the lord, and this difference was visible in every room they ever shared, which is to say, in no room at all. Because they never shared rooms. And if you are reading this now, perhaps sitting somewhere comfortable with a cup of something warm beside you, consider what it would feel like to live inside a body that has been working since the age of 8 or 9, that has never known a day without physical pain, that has been shaped by labor into something hard and knotted and prematurely old. The peasant at 30 had the body of a modern 60-year-old. The peasant at 40, if he reached 40, was ancient. And the peasant at 50 was a rarity, a man who had survived famine and disease and war and accident long enough to see his own children become old before their time, and who sat by the fire in the evenings with hands that had been broken and healed and broken again, knuckles swollen, fingers curved, the skin on his palms so thick with callus that he could hold a hot coal without flinching. Let me offer a passage of pure scene, because the abstraction of bodies and calories needs to be grounded in something visible. It is late autumn, and the harvest has been brought in. The fields are stubble, brown and flat, stretching to the treeline under a sky the color of wet stone. The air smells of wood smoke and rotting apples, the sweet-sour tang of fruit that has fallen from the orchard trees and lies in the grass, half-fermented, attracting wasps that crawl across the bruised skin with a drunken persistence. A woman is kneeling by the stream that runs along the edge of the village, washing wool in a wooden tub. Her hands are red from the cold water, and her arms ache from the repeated motion of plunging the wool into the stream, wringing it, plunging it again. Behind her, a child of perhaps 4 is sitting in the mud, playing with a stick, tracing lines in the soft earth that mean nothing and everything, the first marks of a hand that will, in a few years, be put to work in the fields. The woman does not look up. She has done this 1,000 times. The wool will be dried, carded, spun, woven into cloth on a loom that stands in the corner of the single room where the family sleeps, eats, and dies. The cloth will be used for clothing, for blankets, for the rough sacks that hold the grain. Nothing in this process involves the lord or the bailiff or the church. It is the woman's labor, performed in the gaps between the obligations that structure the day, and it is invisible in every record that has ever been kept. And that brings me to the women, because the peasant's body was not exclusively male, and the system of extraction operated differently on female bodies than on male ones. The woman's labor was the shadow labor of the medieval village, the work that happened inside the house and around it, the work that was never enumerated on the bailiff's roll, because it did not directly serve the lord's domain. She cooked, cleaned, spun wool, wove cloth, tended the garden, raised the children, fed the poultry, milked the goats, made cheese, preserved food for winter, fetched water from the well, gathered firewood from the forest, and nursed the sick. She did this every day without remuneration, without recognition, without rest. Her labor was the precondition of the man's labor, because without the food she prepared and the clothes she made and the children she raised, the man could not work the fields, and the fields could not produce the grain that paid the rent. But the Lord did not pay her. The church did not bless her labor in its sermons. The chronicle did not mention her name. The woman's body carried an additional burden that the man's did not: pregnancy. A peasant woman who married at 15 or 16, and most did, could expect to be pregnant or nursing for the majority of her reproductive years, which lasted until her late 30s or early 40s, assuming she survived that long. Childbirth was dangerous. The mortality rate for women in the immediate postpartum period was high enough that a man might bury 2 or 3 wives over the course of his life, and the word widower appears in manorial records with a frequency that speaks to a demographic reality we would today consider a public health crisis. The women who died left behind infants who, without breast milk, had perhaps a 1 in 3 chance of reaching their first birthday. A 1303 tax record from the village of Montelou in southern France. I am shifting regions here, but the demographic pattern holds lists a remarkable number of households headed by widowers with young children, a pattern that repeats across the surviving manorial documents of the period. The woman's body was the bottleneck through which the next generation of laborers had to pass, and the passage was narrow and often fatal. I want to be honest about something that troubles me in my own telling. I have been describing the peasant's body as a thing used and consumed by the system, and that is true, but it is not the whole truth. The peasant also used his body to resist, to survive, to create small spaces of autonomy within the crushing weight of obligation. The man who lied to the bailiff about the size of his herd was using his body, his voice, his face, his ability to perform compliance while concealing surplus as an instrument of resistance. The woman who slipped extra grain into her family's bread at the expense of the Lord's share was using her body, her hands, her knowledge of the kitchen, her control over the domestic space as an instrument of redistribution. The body was not only a machine to be exploited. It was also the only tool the peasant possessed, and he used it with a cunning that the system never fully acknowledged. But I have to admit that I have started to doubt my own argument here. I have been suggesting that the peasant's body was the site of extraction and resistance, and that the system reduced the body to a unit of labor. But halfway through this chapter, I find myself wondering whether that framing is too modern, too shaped by a post-industrial understanding of what a body is for. The medieval peasant did not think of his body as a machine. He thought of it as a gift from God, imperfect and sinful, subject to pain and decay as a consequence of the fall, and destined for resurrection if he lived a good Christian life. The body was not his to optimize or to resent. It was given to him for a purpose, and that purpose was defined not by economics but by theology. The labor he performed was, in the eyes of the church, a form of penance. The sweat of his brow was the price of Adam's sin, and the pain of his work was a participation in Christ's suffering on the cross. When I describe his body as a machine being exploited by a system, I am imposing a framework that he would not have recognized, and I am not sure that makes my description wrong, but I am sure that it makes it incomplete. The church's teaching on the body was not merely a spiritual abstraction. It had practical consequences that shaped the peasant's daily life in ways both large and small. The calendar of feast days and fast days determined what the peasant ate and when he ate it. During Lent, the 40 days before Easter, the consumption of meat, dairy, and eggs was forbidden, which meant that at the precise moment of year when the winter stores were running low and the body most needed protein and fat, the church required the peasant to subsist on bread, vegetables, and salted fish, if fish was available, which in inland villages it often was not, except in dried form that had to be purchased from merchants at prices that strained an already broken budget. The fast was not optional. It was a moral obligation enforced by the same institutional authority that collected the tithe and officiated the burial, and the priest who could not enforce the fast was a priest who would answer to his bishop. Here is a document that grounds this in something concrete. A parish register from the village of Saint Seine-Religiaire in Normandy, dated to the early 14th century, records that the priest complained to his bishop about the difficulty of enforcing Lenten fasting among his parishioners, who he said were secretly eating cheese and butter during the fast. The bishop's response, preserved in the same register, instructed the priest to deny communion to any parishioner found violating the fast and to impose additional penance during confession. The register also notes, almost in passing, that several families had been unable to pay their Easter offering that year because the previous harvest had been poor. The connection between these two entries, the failure to fast and the failure to pay, is not made explicit in the document, but it is there in the texture of the record. Community struggling to feed itself, being asked by an institution that claimed a tenth of its produce to eat even less, at the worst time of year, under threat of spiritual punishment. And if you are reading this in a quiet room, try to imagine the physical sensation of hunger during a Lenten fast in a year when the harvest has been poor. The bread is darker than usual, mixed with ground acorns because the rye has run out. The pottage is thinner, more water than vegetable. The children cry at night because their stomachs are empty, and the mother lies beside them in the dark and listens, and there is nothing she can do because the fast is God's law, and the grain is the Lord's property, and the body is a vessel of sin that deserves its discomfort. She might believe this. She probably does believe this because the church has told her so since she was old enough to listen, and everyone she knows has told her so, and the priest has told her so, and the painted figures on the church wall, the damned being cast into hell, the saved kneeling in clean robes, tell her so. Every Sunday, the body is sinful, hunger is purification, suffering is participation in the divine, and the fact that this theology aligns so conveniently with the economic interests of those who profit from her labor is a coincidence that the church does not dwell upon. Disease completed the picture because the peasant's body was not only exploited and underfed and spiritually disciplined, it was also constantly under attack from organisms that the medical knowledge of the time could neither explain nor treat. Dysentery, caused by contaminated water and poor sanitation, was endemic. Influenza swept through villages every few years, killing the very old and the very young with a regularity that made it almost routine. Ergotism, a poisoning caused by a fungus that grew on rye in wet years, produced convulsions, hallucinations, and gangrene, and was sometimes interpreted as divine punishment rather than as a consequence of eating contaminated grain. Malaria was present in the marshy regions of southern France. Leprosy, though rarer than popular imagination suggests, disfigured and isolated its victims in institutions that were as much prisons as hospitals, and then, in the middle of the 14th century, the plague arrived. The Black Death of 1348 and 1349 killed between 30 and 50% of the population of France, and in some villages the mortality rate was even higher. The plague did not discriminate by rank, but its consequences fell disproportionately on the poor. The nobleman who fell ill could be nursed, could be given what passed for medical care, could be carried to a cleaner environment. The peasant who fell ill lay on a straw pallet in a house he shared with animals and other sick people, and he either recovered or he died, and the decision was made not by physicians, but by the particular constitution of his body and the particular virulence of the strain. A chronicle written at the Abbey of Saint-Denis near Paris records that during the plague years, so many peasants died that the fields went unplowed and the harvest rotted in the ground, because there were not enough living hands to bring it in. The Lord's reaction, in several documented cases, was not grief but alarm, not at the loss of human life, but at the loss of labor. The documents speak of wages rising in the aftermath of the plague, because the survivors could command higher pay for their work, and of lords competing with each other to attract tenants to their now underpopulated estates. The plague, for the surviving peasant, was the closest thing to a labor market advantage that the medieval economy had ever produced, and the fact that it required the death of half his neighbors to create that advantage tells you everything you need to know about how the system valued his body. I was struck when I first read the post-plague labor statutes, the ordinances of 1351, in which the French crown attempted to fix wages at pre-plague levels and forbid peasants from leaving their lord's estate in search of better terms, by the cold efficiency of the logic. The king was not indifferent to the suffering of his subjects. He was simply operating within a framework in which the suffering of individual subjects mattered less than the stability of the system, and the system required that peasants remain on the land and work for the wages that had been customary before the plague reduced the labor supply. The statute was, in effect, a price control on human bodies, an attempt to override the market forces that the plague had created, and it was enforced with fines and imprisonment. The peasant who had survived the plague and who saw, for the first time in his life, a possibility of negotiating better terms for his labor, was told by the king that he could not. His body belonged to the land, and the land belonged to the lord, and the lord's rights took precedence over the peasant's opportunities, even when those opportunities had been created by an act of God. The body of the peasant, then, was the site of a continuous negotiation between what the body needed and what the system permitted it to have. The body needed food. The system took a portion of what the body produced. The body needed rest. The system demanded labor on the lord's domain before the peasant could work his own plot. The body needed health. The system provided no medical care and punished the body's weakness with fines and reduced rations. The body needed reproduction. The system claimed a share of the body's offspring through inheritance taxes and labor obligations. The body needed death eventually, and even in death the system took its cut through the mainmort, claiming the best animal, the best tool, the best possession, as though the body owed a final installment on the debt of being born on the Lord's land. The mud that the children's feet had left prints in that morning, the prints that filled with water and vanished, were a kind of metaphor, though the peasant would not have used that word. The body leaves marks on the earth, and the earth erases them. The plow leaves a furrow, and the rain fills it. The grave leaves a mound, and the seasons flatten it. The body works and the body wears out, and the body is replaced by another body that looks almost identical, and that performs the same labor in the same mud under the same sky, and the replacement is so seamless that the bailiff's role does not even pause. One name is crossed out. Another name is written in. The number of days owed does not change. The quantity of grain does not change. The system does not mourn, because the system was designed for continuity, and continuity means that the individual body is irrelevant. What matters is the category. What matters is the plot. What matters is the obligation attached to the plot, which passes from body to body like a torch carried through a dark corridor, each runner handing it to the next and then disappearing into the darkness behind, and the torch burns on, and the corridor extends forward, and the light falls always on the next body, never on the one that has just let go. The rain continued through the morning, and the father set the plowshare into the earth and began to cut the first furrow of the season, his feet sliding in the mud, his hands aching on the wooden handles, his breath coming in short white bursts that dissolved into the gray air above the field. The mother emptied the seed sack into a basket and began to sow, walking behind the plow, casting the grain with a motion of her arm that was so practiced it had become unconscious. The way breathing is unconscious, the way blinking is unconscious. The children sat on a ridge at the edge of the field and watched, and one of them, the oldest, a boy of perhaps 9, was already looking at the plow with an expression that was not curiosity but recognition, the expression of a body that knows it will soon be asked to do what it is watching, and that is already calculating in the wordless way that bodies calculate whether it is strong enough to bear the weight. The mud received the seed, the mud received the plow, the mud received the rain. And somewhere in the village behind them, the bell of the church began to ring, not for a service but for a funeral, because the old woman who lived by the well had died in the night, and her body was being carried to the church on a wooden bier by 4 men who would return to the fields as soon as the grave was filled, because the plowing could not wait, and the seed could not wait, and the mud, which had swallowed another body and would swallow countless more, did not wait either. The bell rang again, and the 4 men carried the old woman's body out of her house on the wooden bier, through the mud that had been the floor of every room she had ever lived in, past the well where she had drawn water for 60 years, past the garden plot she had planted every spring until her hands could no longer grip the trowel, and into the church that stood at the center of the village like a stone ark in a sea of earth. The priest met them at the door, already wearing his vestments, the white linen stained at the collar and smelling of the wine he had drunk at midday. He had performed this service 100 times and would perform it 100 more, and his face showed no emotion beyond the mild professional exhaustion of a man who has said too many prayers over too many bodies to feel the weight of any one of them. The old woman had no living family in the village. Her children had died in the plague, and her grandchildren had moved to the next parish years ago, and so the congregation was small, perhaps a dozen neighbors who had stepped away from the fields because custom demanded it, because the church demanded it, and because a funeral was one of the few events that could justify the loss of an hour's labor without incurring the bailiff's displeasure. The mass was short, the burial was shorter. The old woman's body was lowered into the earth beside the church wall, where the dead of the village lay in long rows under grass that grew thicker and greener than anywhere else in the parish, nourished by the bodies beneath it. The priest spoke the words of committal in Latin, and the mourners answered in the rhythms they had learned from childhood, the familiar cadence that made the alien syllables feel like home. And then the priest turned and walked back into the church, and the men picked up their shovels and filled the grave, and the women returned to their gardens and their spinning, and the children returned to whatever game they had been playing before the bell interrupted it, and the earth above the old woman's body settled into a low mound that would be level with the surrounding soil by the following spring, at which point no one would be able to tell where she lay except by the slight depression in the grass that marked the place where the coffin had rotted and the earth had sunk. This, too, was a kind of extraction. The church took the peasant's body at the end of his life and placed it in consecrated ground, for which the family paid a fee, the mortuary payment, usually the second best animal or a sum of money, and in return the church offered the promise of salvation, or at least of shortened time in purgatory. The transaction was so familiar that no one questioned it. The body of the peasant belonged to God in death as it had belonged to the Lord in life, and the transfer between jurisdictions was marked by a payment that looked, to the peasant, like the price of a decent burial, and looked to the church like the cost of administration. I want to talk about the spiritual economy of the medieval peasant, because it was as extractive as the material economy, and in some ways more difficult to escape. You could not leave the church the way you could not leave the manor. You were born into it, baptized into it, married in it, confessed in it, buried from it. The church's authority was woven into the fabric of every day, marked by the bells that rang the canonical hours, by the feast days that punctuated the agricultural calendar, by the crosses that stood at every crossroads and the shrines that marked every saint's day. The peasant did not need to believe in God to be subject to the church's power, though most peasants did believe, with a depth and sincerity that the modern world, with its smug certainty, has largely forgotten how to feel. The peasant's faith was not a matter of intellectual conviction or philosophical argument. It was the atmosphere he breathed, the language he thought in, the architecture of every hope and every fear that shaped his understanding of why life was hard and what came after death. And here is the paradox that I keep tripping over because it resists easy condemnation. The church was an institution that extracted wealth from the poor, that enforced a moral code that served the interests of the powerful, that preached obedience to authority and acceptance of suffering as the will of God. It was also the institution that fed the hungry in times of famine, that provided the only medical care available to the poor, that sheltered refugees in its churches and monasteries, that recorded births and marriages and deaths in its registers, that gave the peasant a language for grief and a ritual for loss, and a reason to believe that the suffering of his life was not meaningless. The parish priest was often corrupt, sometimes illiterate, occasionally abusive. He was also the only person in the village who could read, the only one who could write a letter, the only one who knew the law well enough to advise a tenant on how to plead his case. The church was the landlord and the tax collector, and the moral police and the funeral director, and the hospital and the school and the archive, and the only institution that offered any comfort at all when the child died in the night, and the mother sat alone in the dark with the small, cold body in her arms. I was struck when I first read the surviving visitation records from the Diocese of Amiens in the late 13th century by the depth of the complaints that the peasants brought to their bishops. The records are written in a formal Latin that barely conceals the voices of the people who spoke them. A group of tenants from a village near the town of Corbie complained that their priest had refused to administer last rites to a dying man because the man's family had not paid the full mortuary fee. A woman from another parish testified that her priest had demanded sexual favors in exchange for her confessional absolution. A delegation of villagers reported that their priest was absent for half the year, living in the bishop's city, leaving them with no one to say mass or hear confessions, and that they had buried 3 infants without a priest's blessing because no one could find him when the infants died. The bishops did not ignore these complaints entirely. In some cases, priests were reprimanded, transferred, or removed, but the system continued because the system was not designed around the peasant's spiritual needs. It was designed around the extraction of tithes and fees, and the spiritual care that accompanied that extraction was, in many cases, secondary, optional, and inadequate. I have argued that the church's authority was total, but I want to complicate that, because an attentive listener might have noticed the contradiction already. The same peasant who accepted the church's teaching about purgatory and the intercession of saints also maintained a repertoire of folk beliefs and practices that the official church condemned as superstition. He wore charms against the evil eye. He consulted wise women about the best time to plant. He left offerings at springs and stones that had been sacred long before Christianity arrived in Gaul. He believed in werewolves and fairies and spirits that lived in the forest, and he did not see the contradiction between these beliefs and the doctrine of the church because he did not think in categories of contradiction. He thought in categories of efficacy. If the charm worked, he used it. If the priest's blessing worked, he paid for it. He was not a theologian. He was a man trying to survive in a world full of invisible forces that could kill him or save him, and he used whatever tools were available, orthodox or heterodox, without worrying about the boundaries that scholars would later draw between religion and superstition. The confessional was the most intimate point of contact between the peasant and the institutional church, and it was an ordeal that reveals the power structure of the system with unusual clarity. Once a year before Easter, every adult was required to confess their sins to a priest and receive absolution, or else be denied communion and risk suspicion of heresy. The peasant knelt before the priest in the dim light of the church, and the priest, a man who knew his name, his family, his gossip, his debts, asked him to examine his conscience and confess every violation of God's law that he had committed in the past year. The peasant was required to be honest, to hold nothing back, to lay open the secret life of his heart, and his body to a man who sat in judgment over him, because the church had decided that confession was necessary for salvation and that the priest was the only channel through which absolution could flow. The peasant whose confession included resentment toward his lord, or bitterness about his lot, or anger at God for the death of his child, was told that these feelings were sins, that he must repent them, and that he must accept his circumstances as God's will. The confessional was not a therapy. It was a discipline, a practice of submitting the inner life to external authority, and it reached into the peasant's soul with a precision that the bailiff's parchment roll could never match. And if you are listening to this in a quiet room, perhaps in the evening, with the light fading outside your window, imagine kneeling on a stone floor in a cold church, speaking to a man who has the power to deny you the sacrament that your salvation depends on, and knowing that the thoughts you are about to speak are the most private thoughts you have, thoughts of anger, of desire, of doubt, of the wish that the Lord would die, of the fear that God does not exist, of the hope that death will be the end and not the beginning of something worse. The priest listens, and he pronounces absolution, and you leave the church feeling lighter and also feeling watched, as though the words you spoke in the dark have been noted somewhere, as though they might reappear one day in a form you do not expect. The confessional was a release, but it was also a trap because it taught the peasant to confess, to internalize the habit of self-surveillance, to police his own thoughts in anticipation of the annual examination. The Lord's bailiff policed his labor. The church's confessor policed his soul. Between them, there was no territory of the self that was not subject to inspection and correction. But here again, I need to complicate my own argument. The confessional was also the one space in which the peasant could speak the truth about his life without fear of material punishment. He could confess that he had stolen grain from the Lord's storehouse, and the priest would assign him a penance, prayers, fasting, almsgiving, but the priest would not report him to the bailiff. The seal of the confessional was one of the most rigorously protected legal principles of the medieval church, and it meant that the peasant could unburden himself of his real crimes, the ones that would get him fined or flogged if they were discovered through normal channels. The confessional was a safety valve, a release for the pressure that the system built up through its daily exactions, and I suspect the church understood this function very well. A peasant who confesses his theft and receives absolution is a peasant who can face the next day with a clear conscience, who can continue to pay his rents and his tithes and his fines, because he has cleansed the guilt of the acts he committed to survive. The confessional did not prevent the system from producing theft and resentment and hatred. It managed those products, cleaned them up, sent them back into the system as acceptable inputs, and in doing so, it made the system more stable than it would have been if the peasant had no safe outlet for his transgressions. Let me turn now to the village itself, because the peasants did not live only as isolated individuals facing the Lord and the church. They lived in communities, and those communities had their own internal structures of power, obligation, and conflict that operated alongside and sometimes against the manorial system. The village was not a harmonious collectivity. It was a collection of families who competed for access to the best strips of land, who argued over the boundaries of their plots, who accused each other of stealing from the common pasture, who quarreled in the fields and reconciled over cups of sour wine in the evenings and quarreled again the next morning. The peasants were not a class of unified resistors. They were people, and people are messy, and the smallness of their world did not soften their conflicts. It made them sharper because the stakes were higher and the margin for error was thinner. A document from the village of Montelou, preserved in the Inquisition records of Jacques Fournier from the early 14th century. I have mentioned this village before, and I will return to it because the detail of these records is unprecedented, reveals a world in which the peasants sued each other over a single sheep, over the right to cut wood in a particular stretch of forest, over the use of a stream that bordered two fields, over the possession of a tool that had been borrowed and not returned. The legal system that the Lord administered was not only a mechanism of extraction, it was also the forum in which the peasants pursued their own grievances against each other, and they used it with a frequency that suggests they understood its procedures and knew how to manipulate them. A man who had been wronged by his neighbor did not need to resort to violence, though he sometimes did. He could bring the case before the Lord's court and let the bailiff assess the evidence and pronounce a verdict, and the loser would pay a fine to the Lord and damages to the plaintiff, and the matter would be settled, at least until the next boundary was crossed or the next animal went missing. The court was not fair. It favored the richer peasant over the poorer, the man with connections over the isolated widow, the family that had lived in the village for generations over the recent arrival. But it was a forum, and the fact that it existed at all gave the peasant a degree of legal agency that the modern storyteller, with his instinct for dramatic oppression, tends to overlook. I have no definitive answer for why the village community held together as well as it did, given the pressures that the system placed on it. There was a concept in medieval French law that might help: the parage, a form of collective responsibility in which the members of a community were mutually responsible for the obligations of the whole. If one peasant failed to pay his rent, the others might be required to make up the difference. If a crime was committed in the village and the perpetrator was not found, the entire community could be fined. This system of collective liability created powerful incentives for internal policing. The village watched itself because it was cheaper to correct a neighbor's behavior than to pay for his mistakes. The parage was not a formal institution with written rules. It was a custom, enforced by the bailiff's willingness to collect from anyone in the community when the specific debtor could not be found, and it meant that every peasant had a stake in the reliability of every other peasant. The village was not a family. It was a credit network, a mutual insurance pool, a surveillance apparatus, and a collective bargaining unit, all operating simultaneously, and the tensions between these roles were felt in every dispute and every reconciliation. To me, the most revealing space in the medieval village is not the church or the fields or the Lord's court. It is the threshold of the house at night, when the day's work is done, and the family sits together in the dim light of the fire. The father is mending a broken tool with a piece of wire, his hands moving in the orange glow with a precision that looks like instinct, but is actually the accumulation of thousands of similar repairs made over decades. The mother is spinning wool, her fingers drawing the fibers from the distaff and twisting them into thread, the wheel creaking in a rhythm that matches the crackling of the fire. The children are lying on the straw pallet, not quite asleep, listening to the murmuring voices of the adults and the sounds of the night outside, the bark of a dog from the next house, the hoot of an owl from the forest, the distant noise of something that might be a cart or might be a horse or might be nothing at all. The air smells of wood smoke and wool and the lingering sourness of the day's bread. The light moves across the walls in shadows that are not frightening because they are familiar, the same shadows that the family has watched since the oldest child was born, and the house, small and damp and crowded, is the only space in the world that belongs to the family in any meaningful sense, not legally, because the land and the building belong to the Lord, but emotionally, because the life that is lived in this room is the life that the family has made for itself, and the Lord cannot extract it. And the church cannot confess it, and the bailiff cannot record it. That life was not all suffering, and I would be doing a disservice to the peasants who lived it if I pretended otherwise. There was joy in the village, the joy of a good harvest, when the granaries were full and the winter looked surmountable, and the children's faces were rounder and less hungry. There was pleasure in the small celebrations that punctuated the year, the feast days and the saints' days and the weddings and the wakes, when the wine was shared and the music was played on pipe and drum, and the youngest girls were allowed to dance in the churchyard, while the old women watched from the benches and nodded their heads in time. There was love, the slow-burning love of a couple who had worked a plot of land together for 20 years, and knew each other's movements the way they knew the movement of the sun across the field. There was the quiet satisfaction of seeing a child grow. Strong enough to lift a bucket of water, old enough to be trusted with the morning milking, skilled enough to handle the plow without cutting a crooked furrow. The life of the medieval peasant was hard, and it was short, and it was circumscribed by forces that he could not control, and that he often did not fully understand. But it was not a life without meaning, and it was not a life without moments of grace, and the storyteller who paints it only in shades of misery is telling a story that is true in its outlines but false in its texture. And yet, there is always a yet. The same harvest that brought joy also brought the Lord's rent, and the tithe, and the debt that would carry into the next year. The same feast day that brought dancing also brought the knowledge that the wine had been paid for with grain that could have fed the family for another week. The same child whose strength the father celebrated would, in a few years, be bent over the same plow, feeling the same jolt through his shoulders, facing the same calculations of survival that his father had faced and that his grandfather had faced before him. Joy was real in the village, but it was a joy that lived in the spaces between exactions, and the spaces were narrow, and the exactions were many. The old woman's grave would be leveled by spring, and the grass would grow over it, and the village would continue its slow rotation through the seasons, planting and harvesting and paying and dying. The church bell would ring for the next funeral, and the bailiff would come with his roll, and the army would pass again or would not pass, and the rain would fall and the sun would rise and the mud would be there, as constant as the seasons, as constant as the bodies that worked it and the bodies that returned to it. But something was stirring in the fields beyond the village, something that did not yet have a name, something that would begin to change the relationship between the peasant and the system that enclosed him. It was not a rebellion and it was not a miracle. It was something quieter and more patient. It was the beginning of a long shift in the soil itself, not the mud that the plow turned but the ground underneath, the deep earth that held the roots of the trees and the bones of the dead, and the memory of all the hands that had worked it, and it was beginning, imperceptibly, to change. The field was changing, though no one in the village could have named the change. It was not the soil itself that was different. The clay was still heavy, still gray, still studded with stones that had to be picked out by hand every spring before the plowing could begin. It was not the weather, which continued its ancient cycle of rain and sun and frost and thaw, indifferent as the centuries that had passed over this land before the first plow cut it. It was something in the relationship between the peasant and the land, a shift so gradual that no single life could measure it, but so real that by the end of the 15th century, the village that had stood for 400 years would look almost nothing like the village that had been there when the first Carolingian surveyors wrote down the names of the tenants on their wax tablets. The shift was economic, legal, and social, and it came from many directions at once. The Black Death had killed so many laborers that the survivors could demand higher wages and better terms, and despite the Crown's attempts to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, the market had its own logic. Lords who could not find tenants to work their land were forced to offer concessions, lower rents, longer leases, freedom from the most onerous obligations like the mainmort and the foremarage. In some regions of France, serfdom was dying not because the lords had become enlightened, but because the lords had become desperate. A peasant who could walk to the next estate and receive a better offer was a peasant who had leverage, and leverage was something the medieval peasant had never possessed before and did not entirely know how to use. And if you are reading this now, perhaps in a room where you have never gone hungry, consider what it meant to hold that leverage in your hands for the first time. The peasant who had spent his entire life being told that his labor was owed, that his body was bound, that his future was fixed, suddenly found himself in a position where the Lord needed him more than he needed the Lord. It was not freedom. The word would have meant little to a man who had never experienced its absence as a concept, but it was a loosening, a slight give in the fabric of obligation that had been woven so tight around him that he had not realized it could stretch. The changes were not uniform. In some parts of France, serfdom persisted into the 16th century and beyond. The region of Brittany kept its servile obligations long after they had faded in the north. The estate of the Abbey of Saint-Denis, outside Paris, maintained the mainmort into the reign of Louis XI, and a legal case from that period records a serf arguing that he should be free because his mother had lived for a year and a day in a free town before his birth. The abbey's lawyers countered that the mother had not intended to stay permanently, and therefore the serf status had not been altered. The case dragged on for years, and I have no record of the final verdict, but the fact that the argument could be made at all, that a serf could hire a lawyer and bring a case against one of the most powerful abbeys in France, tells you that something had changed in the ground beneath. The system. The ground beneath the system. That is the motif I want to hold as we conclude, because the physical ground of the medieval village was also changing, in ways that the peasant could see and feel. The open fields, with their long strips of shared land, were beginning to be enclosed in some regions. The three-field rotation system that had governed planting for centuries, one field in winter wheat, one in spring oats or barley, one fallow, was giving way to more intensive methods, fed by the growing market for grain in the towns and cities. The peasant who had once grown food for his family and paid his rent in kind was increasingly growing food for a market, receiving coin in return, and using that coin to pay his rent in cash. This seems like a small shift from payment in grain to payment in silver, but it altered the entire logic of the relationship between lord and tenant. A lord who received cash could buy whatever he needed. A tenant who paid in cash could sell his grain to the highest bidder rather than to the lord's storehouse. The market, once it entered the village, eroded the personal bonds of obligation that had held the feudal system together, replacing them with transactions that were colder, more abstract, and ultimately more freeing. I was struck when I first read the account books of the manor of Thixendale in the late 14th century, not a French example, I admit, but the pattern crosses the channel by the appearance of a new category in the records. The firma, a fixed cash rent paid by a group of tenants collectively, relieving them of all other labor obligations. The lord had calculated that it was easier to collect a fixed sum than to manage the corvée and the banalités and the endless petty exactions that had once formed the bulk of his income. The tenants had calculated that they could earn more by working for themselves than by working for the lord, even after paying the cash rent. Both calculations were correct, and the result was a transformation in the texture of daily life. The peasant who had once owed the lord 3 days of plowing each spring now owed him nothing but a sum of money, and the money could be earned in whatever way the peasant chose. The lord's fields went fallow or were leased to a new class of entrepreneurial farmers who paid their own laborers in wages and pocketed the difference. The old obligations faded, not because anyone rebelled against them, but because they became economically inconvenient, and inconvenience in the long run is a more reliable engine of change than justice. But I need to be careful here, because the story of the peasant's liberation is often told as a story of progress, and progress is a comfortable narrative that fits poorly with the reality of how change actually happened. The peasant who was freed from the corvée was also freed from the protection that the corvée had implied. He was now responsible for his own survival in a way that he had not been before, and when the harvest failed or the market collapsed, he had no lord to turn to for seed grain or emergency rations. The cash economy gave him freedom, but it also gave him risk, and risk in a world without insurance or banking or state welfare was a terrifying addition to a life that already contained more than its share of uncertainty. Some peasants preferred the old system, because the old system, for all its cruelties, had been predictable, and predictability in the Middle Ages was a form of wealth. I honestly cannot decide whether the transition from serfdom to tenancy was an improvement for the people who lived through it. On the one hand, the loss of the most degrading obligations, the mainmort, the foremarage, the unlimited corvée, was an unambiguous gain in human dignity. On the other hand, the loss of the lord's residual obligation to provide for his tenants in times of crisis left the peasant more exposed to the vagaries of weather and market than he had ever been. The same period that saw the decline of serfdom also saw the rise of a new kind of poverty, the landless laborer, the seasonal worker who owned nothing but his hands and who followed the harvest from estate to estate, sleeping in ditches and barns, eating what he could earn and starving when he could not. The old system had bound the peasant to the soil, but it had also bound the soil to the peasant. The new system set both free and freedom, as the peasant was learning, was a mixed blessing. The village itself was changing. The houses that had been simple wattle and daub huts with earthen floors and thatched roofs were being rebuilt in stone or half timber, with tiled roofs and glazed windows and hearths that drew properly. The diet was slowly improving, as the post-plague labor shortage drove wages up and made it possible for even modest households to afford meat more than once a week. The average height of the French peasant, as reconstructed from skeletal remains in cemeteries dating to the 15th century, was measurably greater than it had been in the 12th. The body of the peasant, which I have described as a machine worn down by overwork and undernourishment, was beginning to recover some of the resilience that centuries of marginal subsistence had eroded. And the mind of the peasant was changing as well, though this is harder to document and easier to romanticize. The growth of towns and markets exposed the peasant to ideas and goods that had once been the exclusive preserve of the nobility and the clergy. The itinerant preachers who passed through the village in the 15th century, Franciscans and Dominicans and wandering hermits whose orthodoxy was sometimes questionable, brought with them new ways of thinking about the relationship between the individual and God, new critiques of clerical wealth, new suspicions about the institutional church that the peasant had always accepted without question. The printing press, which arrived in France in the 1470s, began to spread pamphlets and broadsheets that carried the ideas of the Reformation into the countryside, and the peasant who could not read could still hear them read aloud in the tavern or at the crossroads, and could still form his own judgment about what they meant. I have no definitive answer for why the Reformation took hold in some parts of France and not in others, but the distribution of Protestant sympathies in the 16th century maps remarkably closely onto the distribution of free tenancy and cash rents in the 15th. The regions where the peasant had the most autonomy, where the lord's power was weakest and the market's influence was strongest, were the regions where the peasant was most willing to question the church's authority. The connection is not causal in the strict sense, but it is suggestive. A peasant who had learned to negotiate his rent and sell his grain in the marketplace was a peasant who had learned to think of himself as an agent, and an agent was more likely to ask whether the tithe was really necessary, whether the priest's authority was really divinely ordained, whether the Pope in Rome really had jurisdiction over the soul of a man who had never set foot outside the valley where he was born. I was struck when I first encountered the records of the peasant uprising in the region of Guyenne in 1548, a revolt against the salt tax, the gabelle, by the language the rebels used. They did not speak in the terms of feudal grievance, of unpaid rents or abusive bailiffs. They spoke in the terms of citizenship, of rights that belonged to them by virtue of being French, of a contract between the king and his subjects that the king had violated by imposing an unjust tax without proper consultation. The language was new. It was the language of the towns, of the lawyers, of the literate classes, and it had seeped into the countryside through the porous boundary between village and market town, between the peasant who could write and the peasant who could listen, between the world of obligation and the world of rights. The peasant who rebelled in 1548 was not his great-grandfather, who had thrown himself at the feet of the Lord during the Jacquerie and begged for mercy. He was a different creature, shaped by a century of slow change, and he demanded not mercy but justice. And yet I need to end this story not with a rebellion or a transformation or a triumph, but with the mud, because the mud was still there. The mud did not go away when the mainmort was abolished, or when the cash rent replaced the labor obligation, or when the printing press brought new ideas into the village. The mud was there in the spring, when the plow cut into it, and the seed fell into it, and the rain turned it into the same gray soup that it had been for 1,000 years. The mud was there in the autumn, when the harvest carts sank to their axles in the lanes, and the men had to unload the sheaves and carry them on their backs to the barns. The mud was there in the winter, frozen into iron ridges that cracked the wooden shoes of the children who walked to the well. The mud was the constant, the thing that did not change, the ground beneath the system and beneath the story and beneath the lives of the people who had worked the same plots of earth for generations that stretched back beyond memory and forward beyond hope. Here is the final scene, and it is quiet. It is early evening in a village in central France, sometime in the late 15th century. The sun is low, and the light is golden and thick, the kind of light that seems to hold the dust motes suspended in the air like tiny planets orbiting a dying star. A man is standing at the edge of his field, looking across the strips of grain that will be ready for harvest in another week. Behind him, his house stands with its stone-ground floor and its half-timbered upper story, and its roof of curved tiles that he paid for with coin from the grain he sold at the market in the town last autumn. His son is inside, doing sums on a piece of scrap paper. The boy can write, a little taught by the priest who is not the same priest his father remembered from childhood, but a younger man, better educated, less inclined to demand the mortuary fee before administering last rites. The man's wife is spinning wool in the doorway, and the same wheel creaks in the same rhythm that her mother's wheel creaked, and her grandmother's before her, but the wool is cleaner and the thread is finer, and the cloth it will make will be sold, not worn, because the family's clothing now comes from a merchant. The man looks at the field, and he sees the same earth that his father saw and his grandfather, and the line of men whose names he does not know but whose bodies lie in the same earth they worked. The furrows are straight and deep, cut by a plow with an iron share that was made by a smith in the next village, paid for in cash, owned outright. The grain is high and heavy, and the yield will be good enough to pay the rent and the tithe and to put aside a surplus for the winter market when prices rise. The man does not feel free. He does not think in categories of freedom or oppression, liberation or bondage. He thinks in categories of enough and not enough, of good year and bad year, of what the field will give him and what he can give his children. But something has shifted in the ground beneath him, and he feels it without being able to name it. The bailiff still comes, but he comes less often, and when he does, he carries a different kind of role, not a list of obligations owed to the Lord, but a contract, signed by both parties, specifying the rent in clear terms and the term of the lease and the conditions under which it could be renewed. The Lord is still the Lord, but he is a distant figure now, a name on a legal document, a man who lives in a chateau that the peasant has never entered and who does not know the peasant's name. The relationship that had been personal, oppressive, yes, but personal, a face-to-face encounter between the man who worked and the man who took has become abstract, mediated by money and law and paper. And the abstraction is a kind of freedom, but it is also a kind of loneliness. The peasant who longer kneels to his Lord, no longer expects the Lord to provide for him when the harvest fails. He is on his own, and the weight of that autonomy is the new burden that replaces the old. I have argued throughout this story that the life of the medieval peasant was one of extraction, exploitation, and suffering, and I stand by that argument. But I have also tried to show, in the small details and the quiet moments, that the peasant was not a victim in the simple sense. He was a person who lived, who loved, who resisted, who adapted, who found joy in the spaces between exactions and meaning in the rhythm of the seasons. The system that enclosed him was inhuman in its logic and brutal in its effects, but he was human, and his humanity survived the system. It survived the bailiff and the tithe and the mainmort and the army and the plague and the famine and the grinding repetition of labor that wore down his body year after year until his hands were claws and his back was a permanent curve and his life was a story that no one wrote down, and it survived in a form that we can recognize 800 years later because we carry the same mud on our feet, even if we have forgotten where it came from. If you would like to travel again, we could visit another time, not the fields of France, perhaps, but the streets of a medieval town, where the same peasant who bent over the plow might have gone to sell his grain, and could have looked up at the cathedral spire and thought, for the first time in his life, that the world was larger than the boundary of the Lord's domain, and that the ground beneath the world was changing, and that the seed he carried in his sack was not just grain but something else. Something that would grow, in the centuries after his death, into a harvest he could not have imagined and a freedom he would not have known how to use.